All right, it's time for the news update of the week. This week, Jake, you've got an interesting story out of Ukraine, right?
That's right. Yeah, there's big news out of a small town in Ukraine. As we all know, the brutal fighting there is still ongoing. It's been over a month now. But every now and then you get some, half decent news out of a terrible, tragic situation. There's a small farming community in the southern part of Ukraine. I'm going to butcher the name. I'm not a Ukrainian language expert, but I believe Voznesensk.
I think that's pretty good. Yeah.
At least phonetically, that's how it looks. Anyway, it was a strategic point for the Russian army to capture because there's a bridge that essentially is a major thoroughfare to the western part of Ukraine. So naturally, the Russians wanted access to that to get, armored transport and whatnot. But a small contingency of Ukrainian troops, townspeople, farmers, shopkeepers, banded together and actually held off a mechanized invasion of conventional Russian forces, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? I mean, you had the BBC was the one on the ground reporting this, although I think actually a couple outlets have talked about this battle because it was fairly strategically significant. And you obviously have something of a David and Goliath situation going on here.
Right.
There were Ukrainian troops, but they were really supported in large part by regular civilians, townspeople. You had a quote from a local shopkeeper by the name of Alexander. He told the BBC, quote, "We used hunting rifles, people threw bricks and jars, old women loaded heavy sandbags. The Russians didn't know where to look or where the next attack would come from. I've never seen the community come together like that." I think that kind of sums up this story is this incredible fight that these Ukrainian townspeople put up and the fact that they were able to overcome a much better equipped force that was full of actual soldiers. And
right.
That gives you some insight into this idea of armed civilian resistance being an actual viable tactic in a war like this.
No, that's absolutely correct. As we've covered before, as the invasion got going, that was a concerted effort by the Ukrainian government was that, look, we're outnumbered. They have a far larger military, so we're going to need everyone who's willing to fight to stay and fight. And they liberalized their gun laws. They actively contributed to arming the populace just for occasions such as this. The reporting from the BBC that we mentioned talked about how they use predominantly small arms like AK-47s, which everyone's familiar with, plus British donated anti-tank missiles, shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles. Right. And we don't know exactly the scale and scope of the mechanized force that showed up to try to take the town, but they reported that there were at least 30 Russian tanks and a Russian helicopter that were left once the Russians finally retreated. So this is obviously a huge armored force that came to try to take this little town, and the fact that small arms and some shoulder-fired missiles in the hands of civilians with some troops, but mostly civilians, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's really a microcosm of what you've seen in a lot of this war,
right?
Where Russian forces have come up against distributed defensive attacks like this. It's obviously there's plenty of conventional military fighting going on between the two sides, but Ukraine does seem to have you built on this advantage of an armed populace, or at least a recently armed populace, right? Their gun laws are still strict in comparison to the United States, but part of their liberalizing them right before this invasion was, and we talked about this on the podcast before, it was sort of a symbolic measure as well to say, look, you have the right to fight for your property and your land and your life. And you're seeing it happen and play out in real time. It's not just the Ukrainian troops who had, enlisted and been trained by the military who are fighting this Russian invasion. It is also these civilians, as we've seen here in this specific instance, but also all across the country. And, it sort of underlies this philosophical point that a lot of gun rights advocates hold to be true about how it's more difficult to oppress an armed populace like this, especially one with the will to resist you, and obviously even a extremely brutal war like this one. And to that point, the mayor of the town, Valenchko, I apologize for my pronunciation now, but he said it's hard to explain how we did it. It's thanks to the fighting spirit of our local people and to the Ukrainian army. This is such a strategic location. We're not only defending the town, but all the territory behind it, and we don't have the heavy weapons our enemy has. So it sort of gives you the mentality that's involved here as well. It's not just about having a gun; it's also about the will to resist.
I think that's exactly right. It's, we always hear this, as you said, American gun owners tend to have the same, or at least some of them have the same philosophical outlook in terms of an armed populace being able to withstand tyranny, whether internal or external. And I think that's exactly the case here that you see in Ukraine. You've seen it historically when you have a motivated people, in this case, motivated by the fact that in order to survive, in order to keep your freedom, keep your homeland, you have that motivation as well as the tactical advantage. The terrain better than the invading force. You live there. This is where you grew up. You can actually put up a pretty good fight and take on conventional forces that are, at least on paper, far superior.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, this isn't a fairy tale. And I think in America, the slogan "liberty or death" is removed from the realities of a situation like what's happening in Ukraine, where they face that literal choice. And it's important to note here as well that the same people who spoke about their victory thus far in this fight also were calling for being armed with better weapons than just small arms. You had the mayor, we have another quote from him. He told the BBC, "It's only thanks to these weapons that we were able to beat our enemy here." Talking about these anti-tank missiles and small arms that they've used. We say thank you to our partners for their support, but we need more. The enemy's convoys will keep coming. So, I just want to underline that this is obviously an ongoing situation. We've highlighted this story of success so far and what it tells us about civilian gun ownership to some degree. As disconnected as that situation is from obviously domestic American gun politics, it's still important to talk about. But this is something that is not a finished story. There's still plenty to come in this fight that the Ukrainians are going through.
Well, it's absolutely true. They're not out of the woods yet. As you said, that's important to keep in mind for everybody out there. You don't want to lionize it too much, but it just is at least an example of this phenomenon that we've covered. We've seen it historically. You see it obviously comes up a lot in discussions over gun policy. So yeah, while it is at least one positive development, it can't be understated that this is still an ongoing situation.
Absolutely. And but at the same time, the Ukrainians still have that same will to fight. It seems we have another quote from a local funeral director who said, quote, "These Russians are sick in the head, so we'll have to stay on guard, but victory will come and we'll push the Russians out of our land." So we wish the best of luck to them, frankly, and hope that they can continue their victory on through the end of this war.